So let's start off by discussing what is culture. Culture is a system of belief and behavior that defines the way of life for a group or society. It gives people a sense of belonging, tells them how to behave and how to handle certain situations. Additionally, it defines abstract ideas such as beauty and truth. It sets our norms for appropriate behavior, in other words, what is right and what is wrong, and language. So in terms of culture, it really defines what we believe, how we behave, and how we see the world. Culture is also multifaceted. It is part of who we are, and it is affected by many, many things. So our generation, if you were born in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, your sexual identity, whether you're heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, gender, if you're a guy, if you're a girl, if you are somewhere in the sexual fluidity, you're not sure if you are on that timeline of just a binary male or female, what your race is, if you're Caucasian, Asian, Hispanic, etc. The region where you live, if you were born in the United States, if you grew up in Asia, if you grew up in Europe, etc. Also, you can look at it from the perspective of, are you from the suburbs? Are you from the urban area, like a city? Or are you a rural person? Religion is a huge impact on our culture. In Pennsylvania, we have the Amish, and that picture on the right represents an Amish guy who is very recognizable in our location. Other religions that have a huge impact on culture include Catholicism, Judaism, and Islam. Buddhism, Hinduism, all of the major religions in the world have a huge impact on the culture. And lastly, and in many cases, most pervasively, the media. What we see on TV, what we hear on the radio, what we hear in music, what we see in movies, on the internet, all of these things affect who we become and how we perceive our own culture. Most of us belong to multiple cultures, with multiple expectations being placed on us by each culture. So overall, culture includes our beliefs, the knowledge, morals, customs, language, ways of thinking, how people interact, values, art, laws, habits, dress, patterns of behavior, and music. So where does this whole culture thing come from? Well, most of our culture is learned, and it's called inculturation. And this is the process of consciously or unconsciously learning to identify with a particular culture and a culture's thinking, way of relating, and worldview. So, this is when, as we're growing up, we learn how to root for certain teams, we learn how to use certain tools, we know a certain kind of music is what we like. As we grew up, we learned that we were going to use a fork and a spoon to feed ourselves. Acculturation is the process of learning, adopting, and adapting to the appropriate behaviors and roles of a host culture. So for some of us, we got a little bit older, we went to a Chinese restaurant and we wanted to try using chopsticks. Others of us may have visited a foreign country and learned how to use a different kind of driving experience. In the United States, we drive using a left-hand side driving experience. Well, you go into Europe and they're going to use a right-hand wheel. So you learn and you adapt. In the United States, our population is largely based on immigration for the past 400 years. And at each point in our history, groups of immigrants came to this country in waves. So, immigration is still a very popular topic today, and we're still dealing with a lot of issues. We still have a lot of misunderstandings, we have a lot of challenges, but it's also provided a very diverse and multi-talented group of people who help make the United States a world power. Research has shown that a business that is more diverse tends to be more successful. So if you look at the really diverse companies out there, such as Disney, Coca-Cola, these are the companies that are also incredibly diverse. Now you have a company like Google that is very diverse in terms of having a lot of Asian people, but they don't have a lot of women and they don't have a lot of African Americans. So they have recently made an effort to hire more women and more African American and Hispanic employees, because cultural variability continues to be a critical part of our evolution and our challenges. Here is a reflection of what the United States looks like in terms of the diversity. What you see here is this area with a lot of the yellows and oranges is a lot of the African Americans. Up here you see a lot of Hispanics and a lot of Hispanics. Here, these light purples, Mexicans. These dark blues, the Italians. These slightly more like a sea blue, the Irish. Out here in the middle of the country, the Finnish and the Germans. You'll see that the vast majority of ancestral groups in this country are German. And we don't really think of the Germans as having such a huge footprint in this country, but the vast majority of the Midwest are populated by these folks. So we have to think of diversity in terms of the entire country and not just the East Coast or the West Coast. Another important aspect of culture is language. Every generation has its own slang. So in the 1920s, when you wanted to say something was really awesome, you would call it the bee's knees. And in the 1940s, you would call it the gas. In the 1960s, it was groovy. And in the 1970s, you would say dig it. In the 1980s, it was fly. In the 1990s, it was fat. In the 2000s, it was sweet. And, for each successive generation, they're going to come up with their own terminology. Additionally, each profession has its own terminology. So lawyers, doctors, the computer industry, they all have their own terminology, and we briefly addressed this last week when we talked about semantic noise and the jargon that's used. Social groups also have their own language. So when you're listening to conversations about basketball or baseball or football, and they're talking about RBIs or Ks or TDs, you may not understand what they're talking about, but when two people are on the same page, it is a shortcut for them to understand the conversation. In addition to verbal language, each culture has their own nonverbal language of communication. So starting on the left, we have an American guy putting out his hand to shake hands. He is trying to shake hands with an Asian man who is presenting his business card with two hands, which is traditional in Japan. He is wondering, why isn't this American guy taking my business card? And when we get into a little bit more conversation about specific cultures, you will find out that the Japanese have a very specific ceremony of exchanging business cards and the relative importance of it within the Japanese culture. Then you have a woman who is trying to get close to this gentleman in the white or khaki shirt, and she is wondering why he seems unfriendly, and he is wondering why she is invading his personal space. People from South America and some of the Mediterranean countries like Greece and Italy oftentimes get into your personal space because that's how they assess your trustworthiness. Whereas in the United States, they generally see 3 feet as an acceptable way of dealing with someone in terms of personal space. The gentleman on the right is doing a traditional greeting called the way, and it is a touching of the hands with a small head bow, and he's waiting for someone to acknowledge him. So these are all very complex nonverbal expectations in communication that are clearly being misunderstood. So why do you have to learn about these other communication styles? Well, technology has allowed us to communicate around the world in seconds, which has expanded our social reach, personally and professionally. So no matter what profession you end up in, whether healthcare, IT, engineering, you're going to be working with people from other countries. Plus, the demographics within the United States have continued to evolve, and more cultures have integrated into the fabric of the United States. So it's highly unlikely that you'll be working in a job where everyone will be a, middle class white American. You will be working with people from other countries. You will be working with people who have been in this country for 20 years, but whose culture has had a deep influence on them. The economic marketplace is now a global marketplace, and many of us will be working with people from different cultures on a daily basis. So specifically healthcare or computer science. When we are dealing with any help desk issue, we inevitably end up on the phone with somebody who is on a phone call 6,000 miles away. And it is the beauty of the telecommunications that we can do that. Then we have self-awareness, which is learning about other cultures, brings our own cultural activities into sharp perspective, giving us the opportunity to understand why diversity is so valuable. Ultimately, as humans, we crave knowledge. We are curious human beings, and we find great joy in learning new things. So the more things we learn, the happier we are. Then there is something called the cultural variability theory. It was developed by Gert Hofstede at IBM in the late 1960s. And it describes specific areas that highlight the differences between particular cultures and what they value. We're going to look at 4 specific areas in this PowerPoint: uncertainty avoidance, distribution of power, masculinity and femininity, and individualism and collectivism. So let's start off with uncertainty avoidance. And these are the idea of how tolerant a culture is to uncertainty and change. Cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance desire predictability, and they avoid taking major risks. A country that represents this mindset is Japan. Cultures that are low in uncertainty avoidance see change as a way to achieve progress, and they are high risk takers. And the United States is admittedly a very high risk-taking country. Then we have distribution of power, which is how a culture perceives and distributes its power. Cultures that are high in power distribution show great respect for status. Status is very important. It's not only clearly established, It is accepted by the population. So a country like India, which has a very firmly entrenched caste system, although it was demolished after Gandhi, but it's still prevalent, or a country like Malaysia. So in India, if you're part of the Brahmin caste and you fall in love with someone who is in a lower caste, or God forbid, the untouchables caste, there is going to be a problem. So, that kind of society is much different than a society that is low in power distribution, because they believe power should be equally distributed. Obviously, the United States falls into this category, as well as Australia. People question authority and government is based on democratic ideals. Then we have masculinity and femininity. These are based on stereotypes, not on reality of what masculinity is. So, masculine culture focuses on achievement, competitiveness, strength, and material success. Two of the big countries that represent this attribute is Italy and Mexico. Women have a very minor public role, and work is definitely more important than family. A couple weeks ago in Italy, a judge ordered a wife to be put on trial for not adequately or satisfactorily cooking and cleaning well enough for her husband's satisfaction. This is something that if it occurred in the United States, people would be appalled. But because Italy has a very masculine culture, this is seen as something that is acceptable. Now, in a feminine culture, which focuses on sexual equality, nurturance, quality of life, supportiveness, affection, and compassion, women are heavily engaged in politics, and a family work-life balance is stressed. And you see this in countries like Sweden and Denmark. Interestingly, one of the things that really sets these countries apart is the fact that they encourage their fathers to take paternity leave, and they get up to 6 months of paternity leave where they get to stay home and bond with their children. So within the context of family life, the fathers are being encouraged to spend time with their babies as much as the mothers are. Then we have individualism and collectivism. Individualism focuses on the self-concept and personal achievement, and focuses on competition rather than cooperation, the success of the individual over the success of the group, the private over the public. And the United States obviously fits this bill, as well as Australia. Now, collectivism focuses on the group and its values, norms, and beliefs over the personal, over the self. The success of the group is more important than personal success. Maintaining a positive relationship is more important than completing a task. Personal transgressions lead to feelings of shame. In the example, China, but more importantly, Japan, very collectivist. And as such, they have great teamwork. And as we look at various and sundry problems in the United States, one of the issues often comes down to the fact that we can be oftentimes difficult to work with in a team environment because we are so focused on individual achievement. Now, outside of Hofstede's work, there's another thing that's very important, and it's called cultural context. Meaning is derived from the setting of the message or the words of the message, i.e., circumstances. A high context culture means that there's a high degree of similarity among the members. The meaning of the message is drawn from context rather than from words. Meaning must be implied, almost as if it is coded. So, for example, Filipinos, Southern United States, Southern Americans, Irish, Africans also have almost like coded ways of communicating. And that also can include body language. They don't need to explicitly say something because they can give you a statement with a little finger action and you know exactly what they're saying. On the other side of the coin is low context cultures, where there's a high degree of difference among members. The meaning of a message is explicitly related, usually in words. So, for example, in Germany, most of the United States, Israel, and Australia, you have to be very explicit in what you're saying. You cannot imply anything. So, here are some examples of just some cultural differences that may enlighten what I'm saying. So first we have Americans tend to be much more informal, usually preferring to use a person's first name. So you get introduced, hey, this is Joe Smith. Hey, nice to meet you, Joe. Whereas in other countries, for example, Germany or Mexico, it is preferred to use the person's title. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Joseph Smith. Hello, Dr. Smith. When two Americans meet one another, they usually shake hands. In Japan, two people who meet one another will bow to each other. And in Thailand, two people who meet one another will press their palms together and bow their head, which is the Y. Americans are monochronic, meaning time is rigidly adhered to and deadlines are respected. Whereas in South America and Africa, time is polychronic. People are less concerned with punctuality. Lateness is normal and not considered rude. So a lot of times when you have immigrants who come to the United States and you tell them to be at an appointment at 2 o'clock and they stroll in at 2:30, Americans get all apoplectic about it. But the reality is for them, culturally, this is their norm. The next one, Americans, we love aggression and conflict. This is how you get things done. Whereas Japanese believe that harmony is way more important. Their whole way of life is about achieving that feng shui, about achieving that balance in their lives. Americans believe that women and men are equal, but in the Middle East, women are seen as inferior to men in all ways. It's just a generally accepted idea. And as such, women are in fact treated terribly in the Middle East. And it is not considered anything but normal over there. So here are some challenges when it comes to cultural communication. The first one is called ethnocentrism, and it is the process of judging another culture using the standards of one's own culture, which is believing your culture is the best. So we all know Americans are the best, right? Well, if you are Italian, you believe the Italians are the best. If you are Chinese, you might believe the Chinese are the best, and so on and so forth. The whole thing is, basically, we all believe ours is the best. And the reality is it's all in the eye of the beholder. Then we have stereotypes, which are preconceived judgments about what different groups are like. So the German stereotype is that they are methodical, humorless, unemotional. And Hispanic stereotypes, they're lazy, feisty, and illegally in the country, because everyone who's Hispanic is an illegal. And of course these are foolish and ridiculously false, but many of us use stereotypes as a shortcut to making judgments about these people, when in fact a stereotype reflects prejudice because a group is seen as inferior by the dominant group, which of course is wrong. Anxiety and uncertainty occurs when one is introduced to people who behave differently. Family and friends influence one's perception and prompts him or her to be a member of either an in-group or an out-group. An in-group is a group to which a person feels he or she belongs. An out-group is a group to which a person feels he or she does not belong. So if you were in high school a cheerleader and you looked at the boys and girls who played in the chess club, they were the out group and your fellow cheerleaders were the in group. Now if you were on the chess club and you looked over at the cheerleaders, they were the out group and your fellow chess players were the in group. The important thing to keep in mind is we tend to view people in the out group in a more negative light than people in the in-group we belong to. So, if you are a chess player, you may see the cheerleaders as bimbos or idiots, whereas the cheerleaders may see the chess players as nerds and dorks. Doesn't mean that you're all not lovely, nice people, but we have these, again, preconceived judgments that stereotype people. So, how do we develop our cultural communication skills? 1, we have to know our biases and stereotypes, and then work to eliminate them. We need to forge intercultural friendships and relationships with others in order to become better people. We need to tolerate the unknown, and that includes being patient with ourselves as well as others. None of us can be 100% all the time. The next one is very important. We need to practice cultural respect. We have to avoid cultural imperialism, which is when you impose a way of thinking and behaving upon another culture. Instead, practice cultural pluralism, which is accepting different cultural practices within the larger culture. So, for example, you can respect someone who listens to country music even if you're not a big fan of country music. You can appreciate that someone would enjoy sushi even if you would not eat sushi. Don't negate someone's appreciation for something just because it's not something that you would like. Educate yourself. Read about other cultures. Learn through others by listening to community lectures, discussions about cultural groups, talking with people of different cultural groups. Ask questions in a respectful way. They will enjoy talking about their culture. Develop a cultural empathy. This is the ability to understand the experiences of people from diverse cultures and to convey that understanding responsively. Finally, be prepared for consequences. It's not always going to go well, but work towards preempting potential problems. Be aware of different cultures and try to learn about them so that you don't end up putting your foot in your mouth. Relate to the individual, not the culture. Just because someone is from a particular culture doesn't mean that they are a monolithic member of an entire group. So just because someone is a Muslim doesn't mean they're a terrorist. Not all Muslims are terrorists, and not all terrorists are Muslims. Instead, look for commonality.
Scale. People don't fit neatly into boxes, and neither do cultures. So first, let's take a look at the keys to success. There are 2 most important things to remember about intercultural communication. These are really important and that I've cultivated through my professional career and in bringing to you. The first one is to have a positive attitude. Assume good intent. Assume that the person that you're communicating with is trying their best, is trying to bring a quality aspect to your communication in somehow, whether it's at work, whether it's socially, whether it's an exchange at a store. If you assume that they're trying to do good and you're trying to do good, it's a lot easier to be comfortable with ambiguity, getting comfortable with things being vague, not really knowing what's going on. It's totally fine to have that happen in intercultural exchanges, and in fact, it's usually the case. So let's first take a look at what is culture. Well, the definition we're offered is that culture is the language, values, beliefs, traditions, and customs that people share and learn. As you might imagine, like everything else in communication, it's a learned skill. This is something we learn. We are not born into the world bathed in a culture like these cute little children. We learn it growing up. And we say please and thank you in most of these cultures, and we learn that as we're growing up. That's a cultural custom. And in fact, every part of our entire human existence is based in culture. It's everything that you use to perceive what's going on in the world around you. So then what's a co-culture? A co-culture is a membership in a group that is already part of the larger encompassing group. It's basically that all cultures live together in a single geographic area without anyone being necessarily better or worse than another, even though some people may think so. The area that we live in is a great example. The general culture, you might say, is general, like quote-unquote American culture. But we have tons of great subcultures that are both cultural and behavioral. Let's take a look at a number of them. First one is age, obviously. Your experience being a younger person in the world is going to vastly differ from your experience being an older person in the world. And you belong to a sort of smaller culture when you hang out or associate with people within your culture. You see things the same way oftentimes. You oftentimes use the same language. You're interested in the same type of activities and subject matters. Race and ethnicity, right? Lots of times, especially when it comes down to language, we learn our culture and our lives from those around us as we're growing up. And they very much can be colored by our ethnicity. Sexual orientation. If you're hetero, if you're ambiguous, if you're homosexual, right? We tend to hang out with people that are like us, and it can certainly, provide a number of different interests that you might have in common. A physical disability, whether it's obvious or not. I have a pretty rough form of dyslexia. Reading can be incredibly difficult for me, but people can't actually see that. But if someone has a physical disability, say they're in a wheelchair, you can see that physical disability, and it will guide your existence so that you can associate with people with those same aspects in their lives. Our language, obviously, right? That kind of makes sense. Our religion, whether it's obvious or not. Different activities and interests. A good example of this is like gamer culture. People that really like playing video games, they certainly have their own little co-culture. They have different ways of doing things. They have a language that they use to describe. They get excited about certain activities and interests that they have in common. And affiliation with a distinctly different culture. The easiest example of this is people that are children of immigrants, that they might not themselves look like they're from a different country. This might not be so obvious, but if they grew up around a lot of people, or even just parents that are from, say, somewhere in Africa, then that's going to, be part of them, and then they will bond and affiliate and really feel like they have something in common with other people from that distinctly different culture. And so we also have something that leads out of these experiences called in-group and out-group. In-group is essentially groups with which a person identifies, like they feel a part of. Say if you're a gamer, you feel a part of gamer culture, and when you're with these people, you're in that group. Outgroup is groups that we view as different than us. Maybe they're not a part of gamer culture. Maybe they only speak one language. They don't speak the language you learned first. Maybe they're of a different religion. This is totally normal and totally acceptable. The thing is to keep in mind is we're often lured into a false dichotomy, which means a choice of two things that sets up a competition between in-group and out-group. It becomes the false dichotomy, the false opposing views of one group versus another group. It artificially sets up a competition, essentially because we are tribal creatures. There's a great video you'll watch about that. We tend to want to help people in our own tribe. So it comes to the detriment of people outside of our tribe. It sets up that competition. Currently, we see this a lot in our national co-cultures. I think you can see that why we have some issues in this country getting along. You can see those as in-group and out-group. And we also have different ways that cultures communicate. So let's take a moment to look at high context and low context cultures. This one can be a little bit confusing. So first, let's get our definitions right out. What do we mean by context? This is usually the one that throws people. Context, in this particular instance, is the circumstances or settings for an event, a statement, or idea. And the key thing is that it provides the terms of understanding these messages. So it's not the message itself, it's everything else around it. It's what the message is bathed with, right? For an example, if you got a gift, that gift might be the message, but how it's wrapped, whether it comes in a box here or somebody just threw it in a paper bag, stapled it shut and gave it to you, can have a lot of meaning surrounding that particular exchange. Like, where does the message reside in the context it is delivered? Or does the message reside in the language itself? If the message resides in the language itself, we say that the context is of a low context environment, right? If it resides in everything that goes with it, that's high context. And there's some simple definitions. Low context cultures use language to express thoughts, feelings, and ideas very explicitly. Like most of Western culture, like American culture and Western Europe, Canada, Australia, we do this. We really focus on the words we use. Whereas a high context culture relies a lot on nonverbal cues to sort of maintain a social harmony so we can all get along. The easiest one to think of is in a business situation. In a Western style business situation, America, Western Europe, people meet, they get down to business right away. They get their terms, like we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They get their business done, and then they'll get to know each other afterward. Maybe everybody go out to dinner afterward. In a high context culture, it's kind of the other way around. People don't want to offend each other. They're really interested in keeping that social harmony. So whereas a low context culture might be comfortable saying, "Oh no, that we don't think that's a great idea," kind of right off the bat, and nobody gets offended, right? It might be taken as somewhat of an affront in a high context culture. So you might not want to call out that you don't like a person's idea. You'll use your body language. You'll say, well, that sounds good. Let's see what other options might be there, to sort of deliver the message that maybe that's not your favorite option. And like I said, everything operates on a continuum. So on the left, we have low context cultures, right? These Western sort of cultures we were talking about. And on the right, we have high context cultures. Cultures that you mostly find in Asia, Africa, right? China, Vietnam, Japan, a lot of West African cultures like Liberia, or even East African cultures like Kenya and Ethiopia. In a lot of Arab cultures in the Middle East are going to be that high context. And there's this real interesting connection, it turns out, that the countries that tend to prefer the cultures that tend to prefer low context in communication in their past, they have had a lot of contact with outsiders, right? And people in the Western world tend to travel a lot more. America itself is made of immigrants, so we're used to interacting with people from a lot of different cultures. And people from high context cultures at one point in time, not now, but back in their history, they didn't have as much interaction from people with a completely different culture. Like China is huge, right? And it's been around for at least a couple thousand years. And as the culture was developing, it was a lot easier to use subtle cues to say what you wanted to say rather than having to come right out and say it. So this obviously affects our business situation, right? There's a lot of work-based learning in this course. So this is an interesting graph, and you'll see it also on Canvas. And it talks about different cultural differences and what styles that they tend to use and what styles that they tend to employ in different ways. So you can see on the low context column, we'll look at sort of like decision making. So it's logical, linear, and rule-oriented. We're going to make decisions this way, and we're going to apply everything to this rule. Whereas in high context, it's intuitive, it's relational. You sort of make decisions based on, well, who's in the room? Well, what do they feel? Let's see, how do we feel about this situation? Versus low context may go with the solid facts. It's thick stuff. There's more about it coming up. But first, let's take a look at individualism and collectivism. These are two different ways to look at culture, and in fact, two different ways that members from a culture sort of view themselves and how they fit into a particular culture. So the first one that we're going to take a quick look at is individualistic culture. These are generally these Western cultures that use low context communication. It's really great. The low context, high context tends to apply to individualistic and collectivist cultures. So individualistic cultures tend to be low context communicators. America, Canada, the UK, Australia, those types of things. And they tend to view their position in the culture as their primary responsibility is to themselves, like the individual, like in the immediate family, right? I sort of take care of me, I take care of my family, we're very rugged, we count on ourselves, that type of thing. Whereas a collectivist culture, they feel more of an obligation to the extended family, the larger group, the society as a whole. They feel more of an obligation to the group than they do to themselves. And neither's right and neither's wrong. It's just different ways that cultures have come to look at their position in the world. And let's take a look at a couple graphs that make it easier. So we're looking at traits of collectivist culture. There are social rules that promote selflessness. It's really good to give to the group. When they're thinking about what they're going to do, maybe they would think about what would be best for society as a whole rather than what would be best for them at that point. And their families and communities and the health of those communities really play a central role. I'll give you a quick example. In a traits of a collectivist culture, especially like if you go to a place like Japan, you'll see less litter in the big cities, in Tokyo. And mostly because people will take the time to pick it up and throw it in a garbage can, right? But at work, a person may not necessarily want to take credit for this great idea they had because they don't want to embarrass the other people on their team. They want it to come forth as the team had this great idea. Whereas in individualistic cultures, that particular team idea would be backwards. We tend to celebrate the individual. We tend to want to focus on like our different triumphs. And when we talk about this type of thing, individualistic cultures really kind of get a bad name. The way that we talk about it, they get a bad rap. There's a lot of good in both cultures. So individualistic cultures, we like to think about how we're unique. We are our own special person, and we are different from those around us, and that's a good thing. We think about autonomy. which means we get to be able to make our own decisions in our own lives. We have free will, so to speak. We think about independence. We have all these options to do what we want. Choose what career path we would like to have. Choose what job we would like to have. And in fact, where we would like to live. And self-sufficiency. We try to rely on ourselves. We value people that can use some of their skills to solve some problems. And now, these things aren't really good. These things aren't really bad. It's entirely your opinion. There's not necessarily one way that is better than the other. It's just the way that cultures tend to look at themselves. And a final on individualistic cultures, that same work situation where a person had a great idea. In individualistic cultures, we really celebrate that person. Wow, what a great accomplishment. Maybe at a big meeting, the regional manager would call that person up on stage and be like, look, this is Jennifer, and Jennifer had this great and fantastic idea, and she worked with Lydia. Let's get Lydia up here. And everybody claps, yay, right? But for someone in a collectivist culture, this would probably be pretty embarrassing, because they don't want it to make it look like they think they're better than their team. So in a collectivist culture, that regional manager might just ask the whole team to stand up while everybody turns and waves and claps and says, ooh and ah, and people on the whole team would take credit and then sit back down. It's just different ways that we choose to celebrate each other. So keep in mind, the important thing, and this is important, the keys to success. The most important things to keep in mind when interacting with other people from other cultures, when you're having an intercultural communication, is to have a positive attitude. Assume this is going to go well, that this person's trying to make this exchange go well, just like you are, and get comfortable with ambiguity. Ambiguity is things that are ambiguous. They're vague. You don't really know what they mean. If you can get comfortable that you're not going to know what all of this interaction means, and I think they're doing good, and I'm trying to do good, so let's just go with it. Your interactions with people from different cultures will be significantly more successful. So today we looked at the keys to success. We compared cultures and co-cultures. We compared in-groups and out-groups. We looked at high context ways to communicate versus low context ways to communicate. And we looked at a couple different cultural perspectives, a couple different cultural dynamics that seem to come to the surface of individualism and collectivism. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.